So as we discussed in the previous video, an olive baboon is an olive baboon, be it Papio hamadryas anubis or Papio anubis. One of the most obvious ways to see that the racial and ethnic categories that we use in the United States are social constructs rather than biological realities is to look at the evolution of the United States Census. As you know, the United States Constitution mandates that a census be taken of every person living in the United States every decade. We started this practice in 1790 and have done it every 10 years since. So for our survey of race and ethnicity in the US Census, let's just go back 60 years to the 1960 census. And here's what was asked about race on that census. Is this person white, Negro, American Indian, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Hawaiian, part Hawaiian, Aleut, Eskimo? There were 10 categories to choose from. In 1970, it got a little more simple. There were only 8 to choose from, but it depended on where you were. So in Alaska, the Hawaiian and Korean question was adjusted to include the terms Eskimo and Aleut. Okay, so the former of which is viewed as derogatory these days, so it's best not to use that unless you're intending to be rude. Okay, so also notice that color and race are used as though they refer to the same thing. And being Chinese, Korean, Japanese, or Filipino would indicate a different race or color. When we get to the 1990 census, the word color is dropped. It's just race, and a few more categories are added for you to choose from. There's Samoan and Guamanian. They're now offered as options, as well as is Asian Indian, or you can fill in the blank for another racial category. In 2000, the options were fairly similar, but it got easier to add an option that wasn't provided. You can see they gave you more space for that, and you could, for the first time, you could check more than one box. But there was another big change too. In addition to being able to identify with more than one group, you had another option too for the first time. There was also a question about Hispanic ethnicity. The last time the United States conducted a census, before the one we're doing now, in 2010, things got a bit more technologically sophisticated. One, it's a much cleaner looking form, for sure, but it was very similar to the options offered in 2000. And now let's take a look at the census that is going on in 2020, that just took place, still finishing up. Did you fill out a census? Well, if you were not the person who filled this out for the household that included you, here's what it looked like. For each person living at that address, you include the person's name, you mark whether they are male or female, and we're going to talk more about that categorization in the next module. You provided the person's age, and then you indicated if they were Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin. And question 9 is about race. You can mark more than one box, like before, but if you marked white, you then had to be more specific. You had to include more specific information. In the online form, you had to fill out this part. You're not just white anymore, like in 2000. You had to then indicate whether you're German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, etc. You had to be more specific. If you marked black, you similarly also had to include something more specific. Same for American Indian or Alaskan Native. So there is now a cluster of options from Eastern Asian regions and Hawaiian Native, or you could choose something else. And so I ask you, as you look at all of this, is race the right term to use here? Or when the term race is used like this, does it actually have any biological meaning? Well, we know it has no biological meaning, but race certainly carries the term race certainly carries with it a lot of social meaning. And in that sense, perhaps it's more like ethnicity. But instead of being a group you identify yourself with, it is a group that other people identify you as. Let's explore that idea by looking at some examples. Now, Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence and served as our third president, it was during his first term as president that the public came to first hear about his having fathered children with an enslaved woman in his household, Sally Hemings. This was a debated controversy up until DNA tests provided resolution in 1998. Y DNA showed that someone carrying Jefferson Y DNA fathered Sally Hemings' last-born child, a son, Eston Hemings. A commission hired by the Monticello Foundation concluded that it is concluded with high probability that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children, only 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Though it is important to note that the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society disagrees with this conclusion. Now, Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who came to Monticello when Jefferson married Martha Wales, Sally Hemings is thought to have been the half-daughter of Martha's father and an enslaved woman in his household, making Sally then the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife. Now, Jefferson freed all of Sally Hemings' children, but he did not free any other enslaved people in Monticello. Sally Hemings' children were all light-skinned, apparently, according to descriptions at the time, and 3 of them lived as members of white society as adults once they were freed. But had they not been freed by Jefferson, they would have been considered slaves because their mother was enslaved, and Sally Hemings was enslaved because her mother had been enslaved, despite her father being a free white man, and despite Sally Hemings' children also being fathered by a free white man, by Thomas Jefferson. Now, let me take you to the town of Dulac in Louisiana. The descendants of the Huma tribe live on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. Now, since the late 18th century, they have intermarried with escaped slaves, and also the Acadians. So the Acadians are a group of French refugees from Canada, also known as the Cajuns. So this is a mixed community. And it was classified by the government, by the United States government, as being Negro until 1950. But in 1950, the Huma was recognized as a Native American tribe, so it received formal recognition. So with that history in mind, now let me tell you a story about 3 brothers, all born to the same parents with the same French surname. The first son was born before 1950. His birth certificate identifies him as Negro. The second son was born after 1950. His birth certificate identifies him as Native American. And the third son, he was born in a hospital in New Orleans, and because of his French surname, his birth certificate indicated that he is white. Negro, Native American, and white. All in the same family. The same set of siblings. As we saw with the children of Sally Hemings, up through the 19th century, an eighth to a quarter African ancestry was still white if you looked white. But this changed in the early 20th century as the country was still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War, and Reconstruction came to a grinding halt, and blowback against these attempted reforms was strong. The country then adopted the quote-unquote one-drop rule. This took hold first in Tennessee in 1910, and later, for example, just to point out one example, is Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. The Racial Integrity Act was passed alongside the Virginia Sterilization Act that allowed for forced sterilizations. And we talked about this previously in the Buck versus Bell case that went to the Supreme Court in 1927. The Supreme Court upheld that law at the time, so 1927. Okay, but to go back to the Racial Integrity Act, this act mandated racial categorization on birth certificates, and it made a misrepresentation of one's race a crime. It also outlawed marriage between a white person and any non-white person. So the law stated, and I quote, "It shall hereafter be unlawful for any white person in this state, Virginia, to marry any save a white person, or a person with no other admixture of blood than white and American Indian. For the purpose of this act, the term white person shall apply only to the person who has no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian, but persons who have 1/16 or less of the blood of the American Indian and have no other non-Caucasic blood shall be deemed to be white persons." So they define what it means to be white. The Racial Integrity Act was eventually overturned in 1967 with another famous Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia. This one-drop concept, it sticks with us today, though. So, for example, President Barack Obama is considered African American, is considered black, though his mother was white. The one-drop rule, this one-drop concept, though, it doesn't always work in that direction. So, for example, in Tanzania, in Eastern Africa, where I've spent a lot of time. So, my colleague, Dr. Jackson Njau, he's married to a white woman, and their children are considered white when they're in Tanzania, and they're considered black when they're in the United States. Let's take a look at one more example, and this one relates to DNA ancestry testing. So Wayne Joseph was a high school principal in Los Angeles, highly active in black advocacy in his community. And he identifies very strongly as black. Now, when DNA ancestry testing first became something you could do, he was super curious to find out where his ancestors are from, as so many people whose ancestors were forcibly brought to the United States as slaves, they just don't have this deep knowledge of their ancestors. And so DNA ancestry testing is obviously going to be one way to learn a lot about your family that you couldn't know otherwise. So Wayne Joseph was all for it. And then he got his test results back. And this is what he learned. That he's 57% Indo-European, 39% Native American, and 4% East Asian. He wrote an article about this experience, sharing that his son, upon hearing about his dad's DNA test results, his son turned to him and said, "Dad, do you mean that for 50 years you've been passing for black?" Well, Wayne Joseph makes a wonderfully important point as he reflected on not actually having any African ancestry according to this DNA test. He said that the most important thing in our life experiences is it's our life experiences. It's not our DNA tests. He's saying that, if you live the life of a black man, then you're a black man. If you live the life of a white person, even if your DNA indicates ancestry with a geographic region other than Europe, you are still a white person. Your lived experience and how other people see you, how other people treat you, that's what makes your racial category. So did you catch that? Race is your lived experience, not your genetic makeup. Racial categories are not biologically defined categories. They are socially defined categories. So in closing for this video, I want to share some more data on ancestry here in the United States for you to ponder. We saw with Sally Hemings how white slave owners forced women who were enslaved into sex and as a consequence had children. And this created quite a bit of mixing between alleles that are more common in European communities and alleles that are more common in Western African communities. And it's been estimated that 58% of African Americans today have at least 12.5% European ancestry, the equivalent of having one great-grandparent. 19.6% of African Americans have at least 25% European ancestry, the equivalent of one grandparent. 1% of African Americans have at least 50% European ancestry, the equivalent of one parent. And that 5% of African Americans have at least 12.5% Native American ancestry. There are so many complicated thoughts that these data bring to mind. On one hand, there is the sheer brutality of what this means. And on the other hand, there is the realization that the distinction between black and white here in the United States, it's even less than you may have imagined. And we truly are one nation, indivisible.